So the big switch, I got more racist rhetoric coming right up. What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Common Sense Logical Reason. And as always, I want to say thank y'all for joining me today. So I have more racist rhetoric for y'all. Now, the big switch is an example of fictitious notion. Nonsense that black people believe that's just simply not true. Now, I noticed ever since I added fictitious notion as an example, as a type of racist rhetoric, more and more examples are falling from end result thinking and historical crime to fictitious notion. And again, that just goes to show you how much nonsense that black people believe to be true that is not actually true. But anyway, what is the big switch? Well, it's this idea or notion that the Democrats and the Republicans switch sides. Now, the argument for this is that, well, anytime anybody brings up the fact that everything that black people cry about in this country, the Democratic Party did. There was a Democratic Party, it was a party of segregation, the party of Jim Crow, the party of the KKK, right? The party of the racist South, the party of George Wallace, the politician that said, segregation now, segregation today, segregation forever. The party of George Wallace. And then when we say, well, the Republican Party was actually against segregation. They fought against segregation, and the Republican Party was founded as an abolitionist party. In other words, it was founded on the principle of the abolishment of slavery, and that was the one principle, the point that they was founded on. Well, the response that you get from the left, and specifically race hustlers, is everything changed after Reconstruction. Sometime after Reconstruction, somehow both parties switched sides. There was this magical point at some mythical point, when Congress was in session, the Republicans and the Democrats were all one side, and they all stood up and they all just magically switched sides. And then the Republican Party started believing what the Democratic Party used to believe in. And the Democratic Party used to believe that the Republican Party used to believe in. This is the narrative that they give. Now, my argument against the big switch is what switched? Who switched? Right? Give me a list of all the candidates who switched sides, and give me a list of all the policy that the party switched on. Now, there is no big switch, but black people use this as justification for blacks to continue to vote for the Democratic Party, even though back in the day, black people used to be Republicans because they knew, again, they lived in that time. So they knew the Republican Party was for them and the Democratic Party is against them. But somehow, somewhere, black people switched sides. So really, if there really was a big switch, the switch was black people. But it seems that the tides are starting to turn. Anyway, so I want to attack these arguments that they use to make. Now let's talk about Reconstruction. Now they claim that everything changed after Reconstruction. And of course, Reconstruction was a 12-year period after the Civil War from 1865 to 1877. This was a point when blacks, after being newly free, were starting to be reconstructing, restored, basically trying to bring it into freedom from being slaves. This was a Reconstruction period. But I ask, at what point in time at Reconstruction did everything change? When did it change? Because if you know that George Wallace, he was a politician in the mid-60s. Matter of fact, the segregation now, segregation forever speech, he made it, I believe that was in 65. He was 65 or 64. But it was in the mid-60s. So the South was still the racist South that we always hear about in the 60s. And they were still Democrat. So if the change happened, it must have happened sometime after the 60s. So at what point did anything change? And again, there's no evidence of anything changing. Not at all. So, no, this Reconstruction argument makes absolutely no sense. Then you have the Southern strategy argument. This is a common argument that you hear from these leftist politicians and these race hustlers. You don't oftentimes hear this from the lowly black person that just been brainwashed into race. But the Southern strategy essentially was the Republicans' attempt to try to win over the racist South. Now, back in the day when the South was actually racist, well, the Republicans succeeded in a Southern strategy. Now the South that we know of today is Republican and is anything but a racist South. Even though people still use a racist South narrative, but the racist South just doesn't exist anymore. And it doesn't exist anymore after they switched to being Republicans. But the problem with this whole Southern strategy argument is that the South switched. The parties never switched. So when you ever hear people talk about the Southern strategy, the Southern strategy is a ridiculous argument, because as I said, the parties never switch. The Southern strategy was basically a strategy of trying to win the South to be Republicans, and when they became Republicans, the racist South went away. But they changed, not the parties. Anyway, y'all, there was no such thing as no big switch. The big switch is a big myth, a big lie. It never happened. But the leftists will keep telling this lie to keep black people on the Democratic plantation, to keep black people supporting the Democrats, to keep black people voting for the Democrats. And the fact is, they say that they want to believe that everything changed, but the Democratic Party is still harming black people today. The Democratic Party is the party that's pushing more and more victimhood, more and more government dependency, Obama phones, all these student loan abolishment or whatever, or forgiveness. Then what you're going to have is you're going to have more and more people going to school knowing that it's going to be forgiven. They're just going to abuse the system, and that's always what happens when you have government involved. You have an abusive system. But the Democratic Party is the party today that's still harming black people, that still keep pushing black victimhood, still keep making black folks dependents, and still keep pushing for policy that's going to create more and more government dependency. So even today, the Democratic Party is really still against black people. But black people, they've managed to con black people to keep voting for them. It makes absolutely no sense. But regardless to say, as I said, the big switch never happened. The Democratic Party is largely the same Democratic Party from the past, and the Republican Party is still largely the same Republican Party. So the next time you hear any one of these race hustlers starts talking about the big switch, well, now you know, and knowing it's half the battle, and it's always, always, always y'all. Until next time.